man? How you doing?
Good. I just finished a hunt this past weekend, so having a little bit of decompression yesterday evening, and now I'm back to creating.
Nice. Well, I mean, for people that may not be familiar with you, I want to ask you about the hunt that just ended, and actually what you do afterwards too. But maybe a brief introduction to, who you are and what your thing is.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Mansal, and I have an organization called Sacred Hunting. And uh, basically, what I like to say is I facilitate transformation for people, and I just so happen to use hunting and plant medicine and Native American rituals in order to facilitate that. So, yesterday, or this past weekend, we had a hunt where six participants came, and one of as an example, one of them was a 16-year-old, and we went through ceremony, and he had an opportunity to just cry about losing his father, and like really feel supported by a group of other men, and come through the experience feeling like he kind of transitioned from boyhood to manhood, and he didn't even kill an animal. And so that's why I always say, it's more about the transformation than it is the hunting per se. But that's what I do pretty much full time, and I facilitated over 30 different experiences in the past couple of years, and looks like I've got a full plate this year as well.
Nice. How long you been doing this?
So I've been doing this for 3 years, but in the current incarnation of sacred hunting, it's been about 2 years. Right after COVID started, it basically is when, or right before it started, is when I started like really committing to this as my vocation or dharma, if you will.
Mhm.
Beforehand, it was just kind of a thing that I did for friends who wanted to have a similar experience as I.
Yeah, I got a ton of questions for you, but just to give you some context for why I was interested in having this discussion with you. I don't know if you're aware, but in the Bitcoin community, quote unquote, there's quite there's a lot of like carnivore or high meat, diets. And although it may seem initially strange, like the culture emerging around Bitcoin is far more than just, people making investments and trying to make money. It's a somewhat of a profound cultural phenomenon, and it involves not just learning about money and economics and finance and investing, but it has to do with diet, and it has to do with healthy lifestyle, and it has to do with history and philosophy. And it's really interesting to see this thing emerging. um, but naturally, when you put your eye of interest on something and you look at its current incarnation in the existing world, well, when you throw your analysis on something like the modern industrial food system, it's horrifying, right? And so, this may be a little bit hoity-toity, but I think in general, Bitcoiners, one of their primary orientations is they're seeking truth. And the truth doesn't matter if that truth is about money or history or food or diet or whatever. And so we want to establish we want to determine what the best relationship with our food should be, I guess is the best umbrella way to say it. And as I said, a lot of people are coming to appreciate the benefits of a high meat diet, but it's obviously not just the what, but it's the how and the context that you put around this stuff. And so there's a lot of people interested in regenerative agriculture, and there's a lot of people interested in hunting. And what I really liked about your book and your work is, at least, and I've been on one hunt in my life, right? So I'm coming from a very experienced perspective, but I always felt uneasy about just going into the grocery store and picking up, a nice plastic wrap steak and bringing it home and cooking it, and being so detached from the reality of the process behind that, right? Because, my dollars, my demand is killing that animal anyways. And I felt bad that I wasn't involved in that process. I was outsourcing the nitty-gritty to somebody else. And not only that, but my dollars were making sure that animal was, in most cases, having a pretty shitty life. And so that was, I've always been uneasy about that. And that's why I went on my first hunt in 2020, and when possible, have been trying to choose sources of meat that, if are not, hunted by myself or someone that I know, are at least raised as ethically and naturally as possible. So all that just to say, I think the truth of this relationship with food is having a sacred, is the context should be sacred, because you're taking, not only are you taking life, which should be done with the utmost, respect and care, but you're also transmuting, you're taking that nutrition that life is giving you, and hopefully transmuting it into good in the world, right? It's a very kind of alchemical concept, and it's a very holy concept. And so I think the proper relationship is to make it sacred. And, it's awesome to see that people like yourself are really expanding this and making it available to people. So I guess one of the first questions is just how you came about wanting to do this. 2 or 3 years ago, what was the impetus behind not only just deciding that you wanted to do this and take people along and share the experience with them, but also integrating, things like entheogens and other sacred practices to properly contextualize this? And what does that context actually mean to you?
Yeah, great question and great elaboration on where you're coming from. Personally, I've been involved in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency for a long time, and I think there's probably a cohesive through line for a lot of the community to kind of remove the middleman and an awareness that a lot of the systems that are currently built are flawed or broken, and that there's a desire to have more self-responsibility, to have more self-sovereignty and things like that. And that applies both to, financials with cryptocurrency. It applies to being able to acquire one's own meat, but it also is applicable to our own relationship with a higher power. And I saw a statistic recently that basically said something like 70 to 80% of people, at least in my generation, are spiritual but not religious. And I believe humans have evolved to have a certain relationship with a higher power, and that might be just the universal laws of gravity and physics, et cetera, that govern the way that we live. But so I think that there's this really deep opportunity for us to check in with all these different areas in our sovereignty with regards to them. And for me, the relationship really started from that place. I had not grown up hunting. I had, some misconceptions and also just judgments about how it is traditionally done. And that kind of kept me a little bit separated from it. But I did desire to have a connection to the process of killing an animal, knowing what that's like, taking responsibility for it. And in retrospect, it was very much a desire to connect with some masculine part of me that I had never had modeled. There's we can all have males in our life, but oftentimes if they're not emotionally available, they haven't done enough work on themselves, it's hard to get the same level of virtues that our ancestors would have gotten from wise elders and things like that. So I pursued the practice of hunting for those reasons. And my spiritual teacher, he helped me see all of these experiences and how they fit into my life. But it was accidental that I was going on a hunt and I inadvertently scheduled to do ayahuasca in a men's retreat setting. And so I had this really close proximity from a time perspective between doing some pretty intense entheogens and plant medicine and then having my first hunting experience. And that is really what started to shape it for me from just a utilitarian learning how to hunt, which there's nothing wrong with it per se, perspective, into a more like sacred practice for me to be spiritually connected to death. There's also a lot of overlap between the Stoics and a lot of people in the Bitcoin community from what I've seen. And the Stoics believed in having a connection to death regularly as a way of living more fully and being more present to our the finality of our lives. And so I use it for that purpose as well, which is a very kind of spiritual connection, to be philosophically connected to death. And I got really lucky that I have been drawn to spend time with a spiritual teacher for 9 years who has a very deep well of knowledge around indigenous cultures and practices and philosophies, and has shared all that with me. And so I really have just brought all of that together. And a lot of my friends, they like to joke about this, but with sacred hunting, I've kind of created a world that is all the things that I find most interesting and most true and most virtuous. And I just invite other people into that world. And so it is, partially different indigenous rites of passage and things that I've learned and things that I've picked up, but it's also wisdom traditions from Christianity and Islam and all the different things that I've experienced in my life, also through some of the hardest times in my life, like spending time in prison and things like that. And that I have seen supports many men and women. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. So is it fair to say that at least the hunting element of this came from a sense of yearning or an absence of the masculine? And you thought like, well, the thing that feels maybe that I even have the most obvious aversion to, in a sense, I mean, if I'm not feeling very masculine, then hunting is probably not one of the things that, I'm being pulled to. But because of that, you were pulled to it because you kind of wanted to confront the lack of masculinity maybe. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, when I grew up, I didn't have masculine role models and I didn't know what it meant to be a man. So when I came out of prison and I started to have this inquiry, I didn't realize it at the time. I really just followed what was most interesting to me. And so I followed and did jujitsu for a couple of years. And then I decided I wanted to do hunting. And in retrospect, it wasn't something in the moment that I decided was going to be a practice of masculinity. But in retrospect, I can definitely see where I was on, the cliche, like I was on a journey in my life to find out through embodied practices, what does it actually mean to be a man? And that's not only what I teach through the sacred hunting experiences, but that's what I continually am learning, even as I lead year after year, because there's always something new and there's always an edge that I am on to learn and to heal, the masculine. And I can have, I have examples from this weekend even that were super profound. But definitely, masculinity is a huge part of it.
Yeah, I'd like to hear some of those examples in a few minutes, but it seems like such the case that for whatever confluence of factors, because obviously there are many, and a lot of us in the Bitcoin world would say that the fact that our society and culture is predicated on a fiat money system is at least contributes to this softening of all the edges in society and this gulf that gets created between reality, perception and reality, effectively, from consequence. And I think part of the reason why there's a pull for so many to encounter those things is because there's like a really obvious and confronting realness to those things, whether it's hunting, whether it's combat sports, jujitsu, Muay Thai, whatever, whether it's proof of work and Bitcoin, for example, like these are things that are unavoidably consequential, let's say. And if you're not fully present, and if you don't call upon certain aspects of yourself, they're going to defeat you in some way, whether you just can't handle the situation, or you're actually defeated in a combat situation. You know what I mean? Like it really, and I think that's part of the reason why these things are emerging. And at least my observations in this space, in the world that I play in, like that, a lot of that stuff is happening. Like I said to you before, like when people are seeking this return to realness, this return to truth out of a society and culture that is so much predicated on delusion, illusion, ego, etc., there's such a yearning for that. And it's interesting that there's so many shelling points for that. So many people seem to be converging on these things. And before we get into some of the direct experiences and stuff like that, what is the general, if there is one, setup for this? Like, how are entheogens integrated into like a trip, perhaps like you had this weekend or last weekend?
Yeah, the way that I utilize them is, so many people, I believe oftentimes, especially in spiritual communities, plant medicines can be kind of co-opted and maybe overutilized because it's such a quick way to a certain perspective. And I think that's super valuable, but it can definitely become a crutch where, journaling or time, or, time in nature, whatever the case may be, might be more helpful, but a little bit harder to do, so to speak. And so what I find really valuable is using an entheogen in a specific context to provide perspective. And so going and doing something like ayahuasca is by itself, which I did, is great. And I'll do that, every so often. But what I'm trying to do is not just have people come to experience the entheogen, it's to have all of the learnings and the teachings that come from a hunting experience, the embodied wisdom that is coming through when you have a gun in your sights and either you miss the shot or whatever. There's a lesson there, right? And that lesson about maybe I didn't practice enough, and where am I not practicing and preparing enough in the rest of my life? Maybe I see an animal and I decide not to shoot because it's not the right shot and I don't want to wound the animal. So I have a great reflection of my ethics and my morality, which shows me, who I am and who I want to be. Well, all of these things that come up in the hunt, it's really valuable to integrate them through some type of context and perspective. And entheogens have had they've had a reputation for doing that in many different cultures for thousands of years. And so I think that there's a really storied tradition historically of using entheogens and hunting together. And oftentimes in the parlance of the indigenous people, it would be for hunting magic, so to speak. But in the modern way that I do it, it's very much meant to support that transformation and that perspective, have a new outlook on the things that are happening in the moment, the things that are happening in one's life, and therefore provide another opportunity for growing above and beyond just the hunting container in and of itself. And to the point of what we talked about earlier, what I talked about earlier, as far as spirituality is concerned, psilocybin, for example, mushrooms, the word in the Aztec language for psilocybin mushrooms, what literally is translated to flesh of the gods, because it creates not just an intellectual, understanding from the Bible, for example, of what God is, but a felt sense of the presence of some form of higher power. And that is in and of itself a beautiful experience to have that relationship. And so those are some of the reasons why I implement it the way that I do.
Yeah. It's there's so much. I spent several months on two different occasions in 2008 and 2009 in the Peruvian Amazon. Basically, the first time was to go down and do several ayahuasca ceremonies, and then the second time I was toying with the idea of apprenticing to be a shaman, and so I was doing that for 6 or 7 weeks, and then I decided that that's not really the path I wanted to take. But it's that in conjunction with my general interest in indigenous peoples the world over, but particularly Native Americans, books and stuff read over the course of many years, and then my own psychedelic practices, which are always done in the wilderness. There's so much wisdom contained in those experiences and traditions and I'm not even really getting into the, let's say, communion with the Godhead aspect of it, but just the connection with nature that one is able to establish. And then the kind of the wisdom that cultures that have been doing that for millennia have passed down. I mean, I'm so happy that this radical reductionist materialist culture that, let's say, characterizes 21st century modern culture is starting to be imbued and starting to accept and starting to be open to and starting to integrate a different kind of knowledge and wisdom, right? Because both have tremendous benefits, but we've overemphasized one to the detriment, to our detriment, as a result of underemphasizing another. And I think stuff like you're doing and the general interest in these practices that's occurring these days is revivifying and bringing back a lot of that wisdom. And one of the things that I'm always just so amazed with when I have my sessions in the wilderness is just not only the rhythm and patterns that you end up noticing in nature, because in normal day-to-day life, it's windy out, and cold, maybe you run from your car to your office and the wind is an annoyance, right? You can't hear somebody or, whatever. But when you're out there for hours and hours and hours and you're really, really dialed into it, I mean, it takes on a totally different character, to the point of oftentimes, at least to my perception, taking on personality. The rhythms become almost intentional rhythms. And it's really interesting to hang out in that space and witness the unfolding of the personality of nature, let's say. So, there's so much here that I think is going to be a part of our emerging culture. And I'm super excited by that. One of the things that you mentioned, like the interest in psychedelics and some of the pitfalls that exist in overemphasizing their use. And I totally agree with that. But one of the things that is often instilled in people that pursue these sorts of experiences is, a connection or a union with, the ground of being, all that is, the universe, however you want to characterize it. And that seems to instill in a lot of people, and I guess in me as well, an extreme reverence for existence, myself, the natural world, pretty, everything. And I'm wondering how you confront it, or what kind of relationship you establish between what I presume is a similar type of reverence, but also the allowing yourself to take the life of an animal despite having that type of reverence in that relationship. Because I think this is somewhat of a disconnect, or something that's difficult to integrate for a lot of people. They establish that extreme reverence for life, and then being involved in the taking of life so that theirs may continue on. I think that may be maybe even you've got some stories of people confronting that, but I'd love to know how you did.
Yeah, I would say one of the greatest lessons that I've learned from the practice of hunting in a reverent way, as you suggest, is being able to hold tension and polarities at the same time in a more profound way. And what I mean by that is when I kill an animal, or heck, when I even just see a dead animal that's been hit on the side of the road, like roadkill, there's a sadness and there's a grief that comes up in me for this, this animal that has a family, that has uh, different emotions, and they're mammals that are a lot like us. And that is that like connection and love is on one side of the tension, and then this other side is the animal in me that wants to exert my dominance, in a way of manner of speaking, onto the animal, my will, in order to consume it and to be nourished by the meat. And I can put fancy words and say nourished and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm imposing my will on it, right? And so there's oftentimes a desire to do one of those things or the other in most of society. In the case of hunting, as you've described, there's a desire to either just be in that reverence and sacredness of life, or, as many people who have grown up hunting and hunted their whole life, there's a desire to just impose their will as much as possible on the animal kingdom, plant kingdom, whatever the case may be. And in a world where we need integration of our full selves, holding that is a practice in and of itself. How can I hold the tension of the sadness and the grief of needing to do this, but still taking responsibility at the same time? And there's so many examples of that in terms of how we relate to the world. I mean, there are people who there are needs for the billions of human beings, and yet there are needs for the planet, and sometimes they're at odds. But if we can feel both of them, then maybe we can have a more clear pathway to preserving the planet in a way that the current legacy systems have not done a good job of doing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that appealed to me about hunting my own food and doing so in a way that was, and my hunting experience, I don't want to be too harsh on the guys I went with. They're all, great guys, but they were in the category of people that you just mentioned that had been hunting for their whole life. And so it was very nonchalant, there wasn't very much ceremony around it. And, I want that, because part of the reason why, I want to hunt what I eat is to imbue my life with greater meaning, right? To be confronted by what it takes for my life to carry on and persist. And my hope and my initial experience is that not all the time, we're all human, we all get caught up in a bunch of bullshit all the time, but like to be reminded intermittently that something, that you, as you just said, like something that caused me to grieve and be sad and, be somber and that kind of thing, had to occur, and I was involved in it in order for me to carry on. So how am I going to respect that type of sacrifice, even though I imposed it on the animal? But how am I going to respect that in order that it imbues my life with a greater meaning and hopefully directs my thought, my speech, my behavior toward greater good generally? And that, for me, that was a big part of the motivation behind beginning to get into this world, and hopefully, as time goes on, integrate that and establish it as a more prominent factor in my life.
Yeah, I find that so much of it sounds absurd to some people who don't have experience, but so much of my life that is now in service to conservation, to preserving wild places and supporting ethical treatment of animals, whether I can eat them or not, that has all come from killing animals and wanting to preserve their place and wanting to there's an indigenous belief that game animals will offer themselves to the hunter if the hunter and the people are willing to support the rest of that species. And so it's a trade. The deer comes to me, and when I kill it, it's not really about my skill. It's about the deer offering itself so that I become a steward of all the deer and supporting them in maintaining their health, the land, etc. So it's very, very heavily intertwined to have these kinds of profound experiences of killing that lead to the utmost respect for life.
Yeah. I feel like that's a tension that not a lot of people perhaps have the maturity or the perspective to appreciate. I mean, do you get pushback from, people calling you a hypocrite or that kind of stuff? And if so, what's your general response?
I've gotten some definite pushback and some, negative insults and things like that hurled my way. But when I compare it to a lot of the other people in the hunting world, it is significantly less. And I have a lot of people who are, for their personal reasons, moral reasons, deciding that they're not going to hunt or they're not going to eat meat, or even, they'll tell me like I could never do it. And yet they still very much respect and see what I'm doing as having some value and being virtuous in some way. And so I have taken that feedback, and I believe that I it's not an act, it just is inadvertent, but I tend to be able to disarm a lot of critical feedback or critiques in the way that I speak about it, in the way that I feel about it, in the way that I'm moved by the relationship. And I think that bridge is a gift that I have and that I've cultivated that we very much need in the world today, because so many things are super, super polarized, and any bridge between polarized worlds and camps can be amazing. And I can't tell you on the other side of the spectrum how many hunters that at face value might not be able to articulate or might not seem like they are very spiritually connected through their hunting practice, they are open to the way that I talk about the spiritual side of things, and they find resonance with that, even if they might be hunting just like, they're with their buddies drinking beer and all that kind of stuff. And so I think both are there's people on both camps that are stretching in their beliefs and their open-mindedness. And my hope is that in my small corner of the world, I do my part to bridge that united polarity.
Yeah. Excuse me. One of the things that I see emerging in the emerging culture that, perhaps we're both participating in to some degree, is a recognition and perhaps a revivified appreciation for the role of ritual, which is kind of what we've been discussing. Like if you identify things as sacred or important or integral to certain things, right? And we discussed kind of masculinity at the beginning, then it seems very reasonable that you would find ways to communicate the importance or sacredness of these things, to cause people not to forget them, and to allow people to access them in an integrated or a way that's, somewhat digestible or acceptable in the culture. And so for that reason, I think we will see, as we're kind of in this process of determining the things that are of the utmost meaning and significance, and then I think naturally ritual will coalesce around it. And I think that's probably, what you do is definitely a component of that. and rites of passage as well. We grow up in modern culture, and the only rite of passage is like graduating from high school and then university, and then it's so industrial, it's so uniform, it's so lacking any deeper meaning. And I think that part of the reason, again, multifaceted, but part of the reason we're seeing so many of the problems in the world today is that people have just the kind of demarcation points of life, and like who you are when you're, a 5-year-old versus who you are and could and should be when you're 13 or when you're 18 are very different things. And if there's no distinction between any of them, and you just go on through life, and there's never any intention behind phases in your life, I think it leads to what we see broadly today, which is 40-year-old people that are still teenagers, people that haven't matured into the individual that they're capable of becoming. And for that reason, I think, and what you do, I think could probably, as you mentioned right at the beginning, serve as a rite of passage, something that a 16-year-old or what have you can go and do to kind of enter into manhood in a sense. And even when I'm saying that, I'm like, boy, in our culture today, that's not a popular concept, right? Like there's so much, at least in mainstream culture, and that's a rapidly shrinking component, I think. But there's this resistance to the masculine, right? And so anything associated with that is poo-pooed and it's criticized, and that's such a tragic shame for young men, because as you said, I mean, this is something that you felt you needed, and thank God you took it upon yourself to go and find it, and because you perhaps recognize you needed it so much. But it's been taken away from so many people, and it's so so hopeful to me and so important that it comes back and it's properly contextualized, because we have all this shit going on in our heads, right? We have the monster, we have the artist, we have the priest, we have all these different archetypes within ourselves. And culture, at least part of its function, is helping us contextualize each of those and making sure we know when and how to apply them, when to be the warrior, when to be the priest, when to be the lover, when to be the artist. And absent these rituals, and absent being truthful about all these different components of ourselves, we end up lost, we end up subject to our transient emotions, right? So the monster comes out when it should be, the diplomat, for example. And then again, I mean, there's so many examples in our culture today of people not having control of different components of themselves and when to deploy them. So, what's it been like to basically be stewarding people through such rites? I mentioned my interest in shamanism before, and it's quite a responsibility to be the one stewarding people through that, especially when you bring into the mix something like entheogens, because that really can open up a can of worms, right? And people are very in a very vulnerable position, and you have to be the one that they trust and to see them through it properly. So what's it been like for you to become this type of figure that brings people through rites of passage, spiritual experiences, challenging experiences like being on a hunt? What's it been like for you?
Yeah, it's been one of the most rewarding gifts that I could ever be given. And when people have their basic job where they're in the office, it's sometimes possible to grow as a person, in terms of leading someone or in terms of like learning a new skill or what have you. But I am consistently forced for many, many hours at a time to be in that role. And the only way to truly be able to embody that leadership, what many of my friends consider to be kind of a shamanic type of role, of healer, teacher kind of role, is to do it. And I was very blessed that my mother gave me a somewhat naive and ignorant but incredible faith in myself to do things that are somewhat absurd. And when I first started, there was plenty of stories about who am I to do this. Most of the time I'm leading people who are older than me. And so there were stories about my age and all that kind of thing. But, I'll give you an example of how this happens over time. This past weekend, I had a 16-year-old who came, and he has had multiple fathers. His biological father left, and then a second father figure left, and he's now, trying to embrace a new father figure that his mother has married, and he's scared to let him in for fear that he might lose him again. And there was just a moment where he's using an entheogen for the first time in his life. He's 16 years old, and I just held space for him to cry probably a decade's worth of tears and grief and sorrow. And in that moment, I realized that I had to show up as his father. I had to step into the archetype of the father. And so I sat down under a tree and I just held him and I just let him cry and snot and everything coming out. It was a very messy but incredibly healing experience. And I've personally never had that need of me in terms of how I needed to show up as a leader, but it is the opportunity to do that is an edge that pushes me to constantly grow and to expand. And so even though oftentimes it seems like attendees or people who are learning are the people who are growing and changing, I am learning, growing, and changing as much as anybody else, because I'm being foisted into these situations. And the more that I have, the more that I have under my belt, the more confidence I have, the more capable I am in holding space and knowing the right wisdom, the right energetics, the right everything that is needed for this person in that moment. And it is, again, I think there's a certain amount of gifts that I have in that regard that came from, my own pain, my own suffering, and then being able to empathize with others through that. And obviously something that I've cultivated. So to answer your question, it has been challenging at times, but is the greatest current practice for me to grow as a leader, as a man, everything.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that, just how, because I think any leader, and this may be a bit harsh and maybe not the right word, but you'll probably know what I'm getting at. There's probably always a lurking sense of imposter syndrome, right? Because we all are imperfect, and there's an element, even if we think, well, I have the experience and the compassion and the wisdom and the knowledge and all that stuff to be a good leader. By virtue of the fact that we're imperfect, there's still maybe a little aspect that says, no, you're not. You're like, what makes you think you should or could, sort of thing. And I just, when experiences like that occur and, you're thrust into this position where, you didn't ask for it, maybe you weren't expecting it, maybe you didn't even want to develop in that way during that time, but the circumstance forces you to open up a new domain of yourself and probably learn a great deal about yourself. I mean, maybe can you put a bit more meat on just what that process has been like for you throughout the course of, the 2 or 3 years of doing this? Just not only, being out in the wilderness all the time, and then just a natural wisdom that you can pick up from that and the signals from nature and that stuff. And then of course, the interaction with the other people you've been with. What have been some of the major highlights or takeaways from that?
Yeah, I think the most applicable, and I think the most rare gift that I've received is a certain level of embodiment that comes from learning in that embodied way. And what I mean by that is there are certainly people who have read more books on masculinity or read more books on indigenous cultures or gone through more programs and all these kinds of things. And while I see all of that as having value, I believe my presence in how I speak to somebody, in how I remain in integrity with what is true for me, in the authenticity that I bring to a physical interaction with someone, is the greatest reflection of everything that I've learned. Because it's one thing to have knowledge in our mind, and it's another thing to have it really sink into our body and become a part of our every fiber of our being. And so, I can point to, different things as far as like my confidence in the world, just knowing about plants and the different species of plants and animals and how to hunt those animals. There's a certain confidence that shows up in that dynamic of just knowing how to be a sovereign individual. But by far and away, the thing that I've taken the most is just an embodied sense of wisdom through all those experiences.
How do you know when to deploy tough love? Like you're out in what is probably often a challenging environment, whether it's like you're hiking for hours and hours and hours to get in position or to find, track an animal or something like that. Like, when do you know to tell someone to stop being a bitch versus being more empathetic and compassionate? Or, how do you walk that line?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it's intuitive. I have to be connected enough to the person and see their receptivity and just understand kind of where they are in their process. And one example comes to mind of someone who basically they killed an animal and they weren't supposed to be hunting that particular type. So they were not supposed to kill a male in that moment, and they decided to do it anyway. And he said something like, I just had to do it. And I took him aside and kind of chatted with him one-on-one. I basically said, given what he was bringing in his shares to the experience, it was an opportunity to talk with him about responsibility. And it was an opportunity for me to basically say, listen, you need to take responsibility for deciding to kill this animal, even though the rules that were governing that situation were such that you weren't supposed to. But not take responsibility from a place of you're wrong or you're bad or shame, but rather take responsibility in this moment, because once you take responsibility, you are empowered and you can take that into your life. And where else are you not taking responsibility and feeling disempowered in your life? And it ended up being definitely a stern conversation with him where I had some confronting things that I was forcing him to look at, but I was also doing it as much as possible from a place of love and compassion, as opposed to, a place of making someone wrong. And that's my work, to always come from that place of love. And when it does come from that place, I think it always lands well. I can be firm. I can give the grandfather stern kind of energy to somebody. And if it's coming from a place in love, that's like clear in me, and I'm not triggered by what they're doing because I see myself in it or whatever the case is, I can far more easily be able to connect with them with that stern voice.
Yeah. We talked about some of the integration sessions before. What do they look like? Either, I guess it would be after a hunt and or some sort of entheogenic ceremony. How do you structure the integration sessions, or whatever you want to call them?
Yeah. I mean, most of the time I allow the integration to, there's a certain level of organic ness that integration has over the course of the experience. So after we've done plant medicine, we'll connect, we'll share, we'll share some of our experiences in a way that is, it's meant to be, we have noble silence. So it's noble silence for the experience of doing entheogens together. And then once we break noble silence, it's kind of an opportunity to connect where they're at. And that might mean some people, they want to continue having some space to themselves. Some people are totally comfortable engaging and sharing their experience. And then really it's about, for me, checking in with what is alive in the group and following the threads that are alive for everybody. And and I'll give you an example. So this past weekend, we're having this, we had the entheogen journey, and I had a very profound experience with the 16-year-old. And one of the men who was a participant decided that he was going to gift the 16-year-old participant a knife as a memento of kind of transitioning from boyhood to manhood. And this was an emergent, organic thing amongst the attendees, which was beautiful to see. And so while we're eating dinner, I just brought up, what are some gifts that you have given, emotionally, spiritually, physically, whatever the case may be, lately? And so everyone's sharing different gifts that they've given and how they've related to gifts. And then we start sharing appreciation for each other. What are gifts that other men on this experience have given you? And so we're all sharing together the different appreciation. And it's a very loose but guided way of having them integrate their experience together, have a deeper sense of like a voice to share where they are being heard and they're hearing others. And I think that part is really some of the most important, is just prompting them to share and hear the shares of others in a meaningful way.
I got to imagine that these are often fairly, if not life-changing, but profound or significant life events for the people that join you. Is that correct? And if so, what kind of, I mean, I know you probably don't track people after they leave, but what are some ways that people have articulated the ways that the experience has impacted them?
Yeah, I've had a lot of feedback and people, share things with me. I have attendees who have quit their job, in some short duration after the hunt and decided that they wanted to pursue something else. I've had attendees who have really doubled down on their own spiritual practices. So lots of people have continued to hunt on their own, but bringing in all of these different spiritual practices that are I teach them. I have people who have dedicated a good portion of their time and energy to conservation efforts and things like that, just feeling a deep sense of connection and responsibility to support nature and land and the world. And I've had, yes, just so many examples of people who have moved their life in sometimes really big ways, like reflected through their job or partnerships or whatever. But I've also had so many people who check in with me a year later and they share that when they cried during ceremony and I held them, it was the most trusting experience they've ever had with another man in their life. And that is perhaps even more important than the logistical changes that exist in people's life, but actually having moments of clarity and connection and love that they can go back to in their day-to-day life, where they can find whatever relationship that was meaningful for them in their heart, in some place that they can connect to regularly.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It reminds me, I sat down with Bill Richards. I don't know if you know who that is, but he pioneered a lot of the last studies on psychedelics in the 70s at University of Maryland, I think, and then restarted them in 99 at Johns Hopkins. He's part of the Roland Griffiths and one other guy group that has been leading the charge on that stuff. And I was interviewing him in Prague a few years ago, but what he said was, and this comes as no surprise to perhaps you and I, but the impact of psychedelics is not a drug effect, right? It's not like Prozac, you keep taking it. It's the molecule provides access to an experience, and it's the memory of that experience that stays with you for the rest of your life and enacts profound changes, whether it's substance abuse or spirituality or whatever, many, many different domains. And it's interesting to hear you say a very similar process playing out right like that, where someone just having the experience of that type of, connection, intimacy, closeness with another man, and remembering the felt sense of that, and it calling upon that when needed or when beneficial, for the rest of their life, to give them power, strength, sensitivity, whatever, to overcome or to confront whatever circumstance they're in, is, it's extremely powerful.
Yeah. And yeah, grateful that you provided that reflection from the entheogen perspective. And I believe it to be true. And I think many people think about their work, or they think about this concept of changing the world. And that's a very, like, what I think once people overcome the story that what makes them worthy is money and the things that they have, there's another realm that's like a similar type of energy of what makes me worthy is how much impact I'm having. And am I impacting 1 million lives through this project, or whatever the case is? And it's very hard to calculate the magnitude of a deep experience for one person and the ripple effect that has on their family, their friends, and the world as a whole. And so I feel some solace in the fact that I can provide, some of those meaningful experiences.
Yeah, totally. It's super real. It doesn't get enough attention how much starting the ripple, how far that, ripple can go, that wavelength of impact can actually go. Do you, you finished off a hunt this past weekend. Do you need to decompress at all after guiding one of these, both from a physiological, emotional, psychological, spiritual perspective? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, it has varied a lot. And what I find is, when I was putting a lot of pressure on myself and was still kind of unsure about my capabilities, it ended up being a pretty intensely kind of draining experience. And last year I had some struggles with mold in my home where I was living, and the opportunity to go be of service and kind of forget any of my, health or logistical concerns back home actually proved to be very rewarding. And so I started to really shift my relationship, where I didn't feel as much a need to put pressure on myself and to feel exhausted at the end. And sometimes I really just, I use, maybe 4 to 8 hours of alone time as a way to kind of recuperate, because I'm with people constantly, I'm leading people constantly, I'm constantly tuned into their emotions and things like that. And so that can be exhausting is a little bit overdoing it, but it definitely can tax me to the place where I just need a little bit of time to be with myself and by myself. And so that's what I do on, Sunday evenings, oftentimes after I come back from a hunt, and I feel very rejuvenated after I just spend a little bit of alone time and get myself kind of situated, and then I feel like so energized and ready to be creative the next day, and that's where I felt today from this past weekend. Big projects coming up and exciting stuff, and that to be able to have such a quick and very direct way of decompressing and getting back to what I want to create is beautiful.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, because I want to ask you about how you feel, what it's been like to what seems to be feel like you're aligning with if not quote unquote your purpose, but something more purposeful than perhaps what you were doing with your time and energy and resources before. And anytime I've confronted people that, again, if not having united with their purpose, but getting closer to it, at least on the path to like closing the gap between, who they are and what they want to do and what they're actually able to go out into the world and do. First of all, how does it feel? Because, this is still relatively new for you, but it sounds like the response has been very positive, and that has allowed you to do more of it and to refine yourself and to refine the experience for other people. So what's it been like to quote unquote find your purpose, or at least kind of narrow in on it? Yeah. And because I think part of the reason perhaps why it's less draining is when you really kind of align with the thing that you think you're supposed to be doing, or that at least really it has the effect of filling you up with energy rather than draining you, right? You mentioned the office worker before, and most of us can probably empathize with being in a work situation in our lives, which it, literally just was soul sucking, right? That's why the term is so often used. And then as a result, on the weekend, you're drained and you're, depressed and your mood is low. And so you got to go out and get shit faced just to forget everything and, clean the slate, take 2 days on the couch and fire it up again on Monday full of stimulants and whatever the hell else. But when you're actually doing work that you think is meaningful, that you enjoy, that's aligned with purpose, I feel like it fills you with energy. And perhaps that's why, you're able to not only bounce back, but actually, engage creatively so closely or so quickly after one of these experiences. But what's it been like for you to find that, or to have your life oriented that way?
Well, first and foremost, it's been an incredible gift, and a lot of my friends joke, and I joke, that I either don't work nearly at all or I work a ton, because my life, my interests, my everything about who I am is so intertwined with the work that I do that it's hard to discern one from the other. And that is so refreshing, and it just affords me so much freedom to explore the things that are meaningful to me, and have really no separation between vacation or whatever the case might be, and the time that I'm allocating to my passions. And if I had to identify some things that have been a challenge in regards to that, it's one, really empathizing with people who don't have that as their reality, and to really let go of any kind of judgment around that, because I see people who are very talented and they're very interested in things, and yet maybe they have golden handcuffs or whatever the case is, and so they're kind of tied to some work that they're clearly not happy with. And part of my work has just been to let any judgments go, not try and preach or teach or anything, but simply live as authentically as I possibly can. And if that inspires people into a greater connection with their purpose and desire to do that, then I hope to support in that endeavor. But it has been, incredibly rewarding for me. And I think that I have a fair understanding of why that's occurred and like how, I can support other people who might desire that. But it takes courage.
Yeah. Is this probably a question for the beginning, but is this a male only offering that you have?
No, I find that men are mostly gravitating to the practice compared to women, but I have had co-ed experiences and I have some on the calendar for women to attend, and they have super profound experiences as well. Some of the most, incredible stories. One woman came and she killed an animal, and it was something that was very fulfilling for her as a daughter who had two brothers, and growing up, her dad and her brothers went hunting, but she couldn't go because she was a female. And so it was healing for her to be able to engage with the practice and to be successful. And as she's bringing the animal back, she's literally carrying the animal back to process it. She started her moon cycle. So she started menstruating unplanned in the moment where she's bringing this animal. So it was like a very kind of spiritual blood for blood kind of experience for her. And I think it's very powerful for women too. They just they gravitate towards it a little bit less.
In terms of being a steward or a guide or a shaman, or however you want to define that role, does it take on a different character if it's male or female who you're guiding through whatever experience?
It does. I don't know that I necessarily have the words to articulate how it does, but every person is different. And my a job of mine that I'm not really all that conscious of, but it kind of comes natural to me, is to be discerning with where someone is and what they're desiring, what lights them up, all the different mannerisms about, what, when they're nodding and how they're sharing things and what they're sharing. And just to be really dialed in to where is this person in their life, in their emotions, in their desires. And being a female definitely has a part to play in that, but everybody's just different. And I have to tune into everybody on where they are at any given moment.
Yeah.
Which is part of what makes it tiring. Because
sure.
every single moment there's something, I'm tuned in differently.
Yeah. I've obviously been exploring these domains of psychology and philosophy and spirituality and personal development and all that jazz for a long time. And, one of the things that just keeps you mentioned, being dialed in and being present and being embodied. And I think it's very much maybe just a semantic difference, but it always seemed like to me, like the real master was one who could embody the aspect of themselves that was most appropriate for the circumstance, but do so in a, in the utmost, with the utmost authenticity, right? So it's not like, that the warrior needs to show up, but in the back of your mind, you're still wishing you didn't have to embody the warrior, or that the sage needs to show up, but you're still you're still in the monkey mind or something. Like the master is the one that can just, as the circumstances dictate, they can just move right into the one that's most appropriate and most genuine, and do so for as long as necessary, and know when to move in and move out and change all that stuff. And it sounds like that's certainly a process that you're engaging in on a regular basis now, I guess.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm glad you phrased it as such. And all of this, your questions and that comment, they help illuminate for me some of the things that I'm doing that I don't even realize that I'm doing, and some of the things that I have an opportunity to be mindful of as it's happening. So I'm grateful for just thinking about the incredible complexity that comes with these types of experiences, that is in a kind of interpersonal, ephemeral kind of way that, so many of my guests acknowledge in their own way. They're acknowledging Mansal's very tuned in with people, or Mansal's like very tuned in with his intuition, or whatever the case is. And I appreciate all of their affirmation and feedback, but I imagine what they're experiencing is that level of tuned inness with what's needed, and what's needed at this moment, and what's needed at this moment and true for me, and this somewhat complex relating.
Yeah, exactly. Because, and this is probably a trite, oversimplified example, but, as I was looking at world cultures and traditions and stuff when I was younger, a monk in a temple may be a very wise and knowledgeable and self-disciplined and all that kind of stuff person, but, are they if you put them in Manhattan, for example, or if you put them on a hunt, or if you put them somewhere outside of the environment that they have become comfortable and adapted to, will the monk personality show up when another aspect of themselves or another personality is in fact the better and truer thing to bring into being at that moment based on the circumstances? And that's why I think, like a lot of people, be a little bit judgmental here, but a lot of people that pursue these spiritual practices tend to find one that resonates in terms of wisdom and approach to life and engaging reality and all that kind of stuff. But there may be an over attachment to that unitary perspective. And what's interesting to me to see emerging is kind of along the lines of what we both just said, where people are realizing that I think mastery is about being able to confront every moment with what's required in the most genuine way that you're able, or you have the capacity for, and the ability to continually refine that. So you're doing that, in every situation, doesn't matter in your Las Vegas or you're in the forest or whatever, seems to me to be a more high fidelity representation of genuine mastery, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think there's parts of myself that get constantly pushed. I don't know if you or your audience are familiar with JP Sears, but he's a personal friend of mine, and we're relatively close. And I have, some of his comedian friends that are close as well. And at face value, we have very different ways of being. I am far more oriented around like sacred, serious, death, and he's literally like always making jokes. And what I found is he has stretched me, and he has opened me up to being able to bring in the witty, the comical, etc., because that's all spiritual and healing as well. So yeah, if I had any wisdom there to share, it would just be recognize where other people can draw out of you these other archetypes, like the Buddhist who's in the city, to be able to meet the demands of the world in a different way.
Yeah, 100%. And shout out to JP. I think he was organizer of March Against the Mandates that happened yesterday.
Yep.
I think at least I saw him, up on the podium a bunch. So kudos to him for doing that important work. But where do you see this going? Not just, well, for sure what you do precisely, but all this stuff that we've been talking about, and these sorts of experiences and interests, and this willingness for people to confront or explore different aspects of themselves that have been lost, or that the culture has not prioritized or elevated through their life. Like, what's your perception of what's going on, and obviously your role and how it's going to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I have found through facilitating groups of 6 to 8 people at a time, a very deep level of understanding of at least the topics that I'm exploring, and a certain level of to bring extremely unsavory marketing terminology into the conversation. I've kind of like split tested in a way, or A/B tested certain hypotheses that I had around, like, people resonate with this. People resonate with this, and I know that now because the organization is flourishing and more experiences are showing up and all that kind of stuff. It is, I had a hypothesis that the way that I speak about and relate to hunting is very disarming to people who otherwise wouldn't have a relationship or desire to engage with hunting. And that's played out in these experiences. And so for me now, what becomes a priority is, one, I've gotten a very clear message in many situations that I have to continue the work that I'm doing to have like a deep support of individuals and small groups. And so I will continue to do that. But I also want to find ways that I can distill this wisdom and this perspective that can impact a wider range of people. And that might mean, for example, I'm working on a TV show right now, and I also have a documentary that's in post-production where I share myself, I share my story, I share what I'm doing in the world, like amazing adventures with indigenous people chasing, endangered species and things like that. And using those stories as a way of birthing or planting the seed for many people, for the things that I've been learning in these experiences. And in the same way that, Anthony Bourdain took food and he showed people that food can be a gateway to an understanding of other cultures and empathy with other cultures and things like that. I think there's a way that I can, have a similar type of reflection for people, and just other experiences that allow people to come in regardless of their financial status or their time commitments or whatever the case is, and have these seeds planted that hopefully have a ripple effect. So how do I make it accessible? How do I make all of this more accessible?
Yeah. Are these experiences, or these hunting trips, are they like standard? Is it always a standard length or a standard cost and stuff like that?
For the beginner immersions, I do have a standard cost, and generally speaking, they'll be, Friday through Sunday, and they'll be out of Austin, Texas. And there's certain things, once I've done enough of these, that I learn, like, this facilitation will have this type of an effect on people, and that's why I do it. And it is also incredibly emergent, because with nature, you cannot control everything. You have to let go of that completely. And in this container that I create, it's the same. I have a plan, but I have willingness and an ability to quickly go with whatever is emerging. So plenty of uniqueness, but definitely a type of coherent plan either way.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask what the cost for one of these initial weekend trips is, if that's public?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, usually I have like conversations with people, because I have such a range of, there's beginner experiences, but then there's beginner experiences that are, with, for example, I've got people like Ben Greenfield who are collaborating on events, and a wide range of other influences,
Special stuff
like
yeah.
that. So it kind of varies, but it's definitely, usually it's in the low four figures, low to mid four-figure range. And I also curate every experience as far as the people is concerned. So I speak with everybody who ever attends an experience, get a sense for where they are and what their needs are and things like that. So, but I book out relatively far in advance, sometimes 6 to 8 months in advance. And so I'm pretty generous about payment plans and whatever people need in order to make it work for them, because I don't want this to be a pursuit of the wealthy alone and be inaccessible to people.
And how often, like, do you go, or I mean, is it an every weekend thing? Is it a couple times a month?
Depends on the month for sure. January and December, I had one event per month, which is generally kind of the cadence. In February, I'll have four because I'm going to be leaving to spend a month off grid in Russia for some TV shoots and stuff like that. And so I just booked them in February, but it just varies. But I have a whole calendar on my website that people can check out and see what works best for them.
Cool. Well, as you probably know, there's a lot of Bitcoiners in Austin. It's kind of become a, mecca for Bitcoin. So I imagine there's quite a few people in that group that would be interested in at least having a chat and learning more. So if that is indeed the case, where can they go to learn more?
Yeah, my website is sacredhunting.com. So pretty simple, the word sacredhunting.com, and they'll just fill out a quick application, takes a couple minutes, and then they can schedule a call with me and we'll chat a little bit about where they are, what their interests are in hunting, and what their experience level is with entheogens and things like that. And I just get a sense of who they are and where they are in their life, and see if it's a good fit to have them come on an experience. And this seems to be maybe the case less with Bitcoiners, but in any case, I also really I haven't done this before, but I super value privacy and value the world that a lot of Bitcoiners are trying to create. And so if someone, for whatever reason, has a pseudonym and they want to remain anonymous, that's fine. They can just apply using that anonymous name. And also I'll accept Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency for payment as well. So I support it.
Awesome. Well, man, I think it's incredible what you're doing and the way that you're doing it. And I hope someday I get the opportunity to join you on a trip, because I think it'd be powerful for me. And so thank you for the work that you do and for the time today. And hopefully we'll connect again in the future.
Absolutely, John. Thank you for having me, and thank you for sharing, and would love to have you on a hunt sometime.
All right, brother. Take care.
All righty.